Good to see everyone this morning. Hope everyone's enjoying the weather right now. You can't get any prettier than what we got going on right now, in my humble opinion. So I like it when it's nice and cold in the morning and warms up to a decent temperature in the afternoon. So it's funny because I wouldn't want to move back to Maryland for anything, but we didn't have hot summers where I was from. It didn't get that hot. When I first moved to Georgia, I moved down here in June, and I didn't understand what hot weather was until I moved down here and spent a summer down here. I used to when I first moved down here, I lived right over there in Fairmount, and the people I lived with had an old farmhouse. And so I would come in the afternoon, Brother Parks, and they didn't have the air conditioner on because they were gone, so they wouldn't have the air conditioner on. It'd be scorching hot in that old house, and I'd come in. They only had a window unit in the living room, and I'd spend the first 30 minutes because it was close to chicken houses. I'd spend the first 30 minutes swatting flies, killing flies, and then with the air conditioner running until I could get the flies where they wouldn't drive me crazy. And that was my first few months of living in Georgia. Every afternoon when I come in from work, it'd be scorching hot in the house and flies everywhere. I'm like, this is not what I was expecting. But anyway, like I said, still enjoying the cool weather now. So if you have your Bible, turn to 2 Samuel chapter number 11. And we're going to continue on into our study right here. 2 Samuel chapter number 11. And last week we were right in the middle of David trying to cover his sin by getting Uriah to go visit his wife. And so obviously we know he brought him in for the battle and asked him how things were going, but he didn't really care how things were going. He really didn't want to know how things were going. He simply just wanted, Uriah there to have a reason for Uriah to go see Bathsheba. And the first night, Uriah slept with the servants, and he didn't go. And so then David brings him in again, and he asks him, hey, you've been on a long journey. Why, you've been out. Why did you not go see your wife? And in verse number 11, it says, And Uriah said unto David, The ark and Israel and Judah abide in tents, and my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are encamped in the open field. Shall I then go into mine house to eat and to drink and to lie with my wife? As thou livest and as thy soul liveth, I will not do this thing. And so again, like I said, I think I mentioned it right at the end of Sunday school last week, but you got to think, and I don't think David was thinking rationally right here. I don't think he was, Brother Parks. I think, and I've had times in my life where you look back on it and you're like, what on earth was I thinking right there? What was I thinking? Why was I acting? That's not even me. That person that was there for that little short window of time, that's not even me. Why was I acting that way? And I'm sure that later when David looked back on all this, no doubt he would have thought, what on earth, why did I get myself in this situation? But we know that sin, once sin gets a hold of you, it's just going to keep pulling you in deeper and deeper. And so again, he was trying to cover his sin, and that was his whole focus, was covering this sin and covering up this sin so that people didn't know about it. And so, but think about the words that Uriah is saying to him. And Brother Jay, here is Uriah, again, that I've mentioned, that he was not a Jew. He was a Hittite. He was not a Jew. And yet here he's talking to David. He's talking to David that we know the Bible said was a man after God's own heart. He's talking to David, who wrote, most of the Psalms that we read, and we hear David's relationship to God and his closeness to God. And we read about David and how that David had so much faith in God that he slew Goliath when the whole army of Israel was scared to go out against Goliath. I mean, we read about David knowing that Samuel came to David's father's house, to Jesse's house, and he went to that house and went through all them boys looking for one. And Samuel's like, it's got to be that first one. And they went through all them boys. And he said, hey, none of these are it. Is there not another one? And here's David out there with the sheep. And God chose David to be king of Israel. And yet here he's talking to David. And if you think about when he mentions the ark, Brother Jay, think about what David did to bring the ark to Jerusalem. Think about everything he went through to get the ark to Jerusalem. We know that in chapter number 6, how that when he first went to get it, he got the cart and he put it on a cart instead of bringing it in God's way. He did what he made a new cart. And sometimes you have to be careful because you're doing a good thing, but you're not doing it God's way, and God's not pleased with it. But Uzzah laid his hand against it to steady it, and was killed. And they took the ark to the house of Obed-Edom and left that there. And it was there a few months. And David said, I still want it. I still want it up here. And so they went and got it, and they got it the way they were supposed to. And it was being carried like it was supposed to. And the Bible says that every 6 paces. I mean, you think about it, and forgive me for not looking it up. I probably should have looked it up to see how far it was. But every 6 paces, they stopped and sacrificed. As they carried that ark, they go 6 paces, and they stop and sacrifice. And if you remember here, David was leaping and dancing and praising God while they were bringing the ark into Jerusalem. And Saul's daughter Michal saw him, and she was ashamed because of how he was acting. And here is Uriah. Here is Uriah. And also, I didn't mention it, but then David wanted to build God a house. He wanted to build God a house. What was he wanting to build God a house for? He wanted to get that ark out of the tabernacle, out of, inside curtain walls, and he wanted to build a house. He said, I live in a house, but yet the ark is not. And so he wanted to build God the temple, and which we know that God said no, and he ended up letting Solomon build it. But you understand that the ark was something that was very important to David. It was very important. So when Uriah said this, Brother Jay, when he said the ark, it should have just hit him right across the face. It should have just been, I can't believe that I have taken for granted not just the ark, but my relationship with God. And because honestly, when I read this, it appears to me that David's and you understand that when you're in sin, your relationship with God does change. It does change, and you may come and do the things that you always did. You may come and do the things you always did. You may come and for us, you may come to church. You may read your Bible. You may pray, but every part of that's dead. God's not speaking to you through His Word. God, when you pray, God's not answering your prayers when you pray. And when you come to church, you're just here, you're just sitting in church, but yet God is not dealing with you. He's not, and again, we talked about doubting your salvation. And sometimes people are like, hey, if that doesn't bless you, your blesser's broke. And sometimes you're just going through something. It's not because you're out in sin. It's not because you're doing anything. It's not because you've done anything wrong. You're just going through something. And other people are worshiping, and God's not speaking to you. But I'm not talking about those times. I'm talking about the times where God could speak to you. And God is speaking to other people around you, but you know that you've committed some kind of sin, and that fellowship, that relationship has been broken. And because that relationship is broken, until you get that right, you can't worship. You can't worship. And so here is David, and anyone that should have been shaken awake by what Uriah said right there. But he was so focused on covering that sin, Brother Jay. He was so focused on no one ever finding out what happened. that everything Uriah said does not faze him. He said, and it says, he said the ark and Israel. And again, I mean, you also have to think about it. Here is David, and I mentioned it a bunch. Here is David that so easily fell into this sin. I mean, it happened, but it also happened so quick. It just happened so quick that he fell into that sin. And again, it appears that it was just one time. It appears that it was just one time, but he fell into that sin. But whenever she sent and said, "Hey, I'm with child," he had this choice to make. And so he brought Uriah, and he said, "It'll be easy. I'll just cover it up real easy." But here's Uriah, and now Uriah is proven to be a better man than David, because he's like, "Hey, I'm not going to go see my wife. I'm not going to go see my wife. How can I go see my wife if the ark and Israel and Judah abide in tents? How can I go see my wife if Joab?" And we're gonna see about Joab here in a little bit. Here he is. Here's a man that's dedicated. He's like, look. He said, if all my other soldier buddies are still out there in the battle, I'm not going to be that guy. I'm not going to be that guy that goes home and sees my wife. That's not who I'm going to be. If they all can't come home, then I'm not going to go home. And again, like I said, I mean, here's David. David was a soldier. David was a warrior. David understood this mentality. He understood this mentality that, this band of brothers that they have, that only, people that serve in a military setting, in a wartime setting, understand. And yet here's David, that he didn't go to war this time. And because of that, he ended up in sin. And now here he's listening to this guy, and this guy is so dedicated to all these causes. And the saddest part to me is David just didn't care. He just didn't care. He had one thing on his mind, Brother Croft, and that was covering his sin. That was the only thing that was on his mind. It didn't matter what was going on with Joab. It didn't matter what was going on with Israel. Honestly, at this time, it didn't matter what was going on with the ark. The only thing David needed to happen was Uriah to go down and see his wife. That's all he needed to happen. That's all he wanted to happen. And so in verse number 12, it says, and David said to Uriah, tarry here today also and tomorrow. So he said, you know what? I'll just give him some time. I'll just give him some time. He's still in battle mode, and I'll just give him a little time to decompress, and he's going to decompress, and then he's going to come to his senses. In David's mind, come to his senses. He's going to come to his senses, and when he comes to his senses, he's going to be, what am I doing? Why am I sleeping down here? Why am I sleeping down here? I made this bed at the king's house with the servants. Why am I not sleeping in my own bed? And so David said, just tarry here today and tomorrow, and I will let thee depart. And so it says, so Uriah abode in Jerusalem that day and the morrow. And in verse number 13, it says, when David had called him, so here he is, he's still in cover-up mode. He's still in cover-up mode, but he still thinks he's got it, Brother Croft. He still thinks he's got it. He said, well, all right, I understand that as long as he's in this mode, he's not going to do it. But if I get him drunk, then he's going to lose, all of us have been around somebody that's been drunk. And so never been drunk in my life, so I don't know how I would act if I was drunk. But people change. They change. They're not the same person when they're drunk. They're not the same person. Some people can be nice as can be. They can be nice as can be when they're sober, but mean as can be when they're drunk. Or other people can be naturally mean, but they love everybody whenever they're drunk. And so, again, David said, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. And so it says in verse number 13, when David had called him, he did eat and drink before him, and he made him drunk. And so he's like, here, have another. Here, have another. Here, have another. Here, have another. And he said that this is going to solve it. And again, I know I said it last week, but we have to understand that David was trying to fix this thing on his own. He was trying to fix this thing on his own, and he said, well, I understand the natural tendency of all men everywhere, and this will be easy to fix. It'll be easy to cover up. And yet it wasn't easy to fix, and it wasn't easy to cover up. And so, again, like I said, I mean, this is a shameful period in David's life. But he was stuck. He was stuck because he couldn't go get help, Brother Croft. I mentioned it last week, but I mean, he couldn't go to Ahithophel. He couldn't go to Ahithophel and say, hey, by the way, I committed adultery with your granddaughter. And now she's pregnant, and I really don't want anyone to know, so I'd really want everyone to just think it's Uriah's child, but I need Uriah to also think it's his child. And so I need all this stuff to kind of work. You can't do that. I mean, how are you going to do that? You can't. And he couldn't go to Nathan. He couldn't go to the prophet. He couldn't go to Nathan and say, hey, Nathan, because again, you have to acknowledge your sin. And sometimes the hardest thing we do in life is acknowledge our sin. You can get help, but you have to acknowledge your sin first. You can get help. I mean, you think about, that's what the Alcoholics Anonymous and all those other things. I mean, you have to first admit that you have a problem before you can get help. And David was still in the mode of he couldn't admit that he had a problem. Now, he knew he had a problem, but he said, I can fix this on my own. I can solve this. I can handle this. I can settle this on my own, and no one will ever know, and my reputation will still be intact. He was worried about his reputation, and I mean, I don't see where he was really worried about Bathsheba. I know he wasn't worried about Uriah. You know he wasn't worried about Uriah. He wasn't worried about. He also wasn't worried about the men that were going to die with Uriah. The only thing he was worried about was his own reputation, covering up his reputation. But really, we understand from reading our Bible that guess what? God's going to let somebody know. If you don't confess and forsake your sin, God is going to open it up so someone finds out about it. And so here, David was refusing to acknowledge his sin. So he couldn't go to Nathan and say, hey, man of God, I committed adultery and I need this sin covered up. I mean, can y'all imagine going to Brother Randy? Can y'all imagine going to Brother Randy and say, hey, Brother Randy, I committed adultery. She's with child. I need you to pray for me that we can get this all covered up so that no one ever knows. I mean, it sounds ridiculous. It sounds ridiculous to say it that way, but what was David doing? He was trying to cover that sin up. So he said, well, I can't do that. I can't do that. And then he couldn't even go to God. He couldn't even go to God because, I mean, you know how it is. When you have something between you and God, that's the thing that has to be dealt with. And so you can't, you can go and you can pray for the peace of Jerusalem and you can do all this other stuff, but the whole time you're like, this is the thing that has to be dealt with. And until I acknowledge my sin and confess my sin to God, that's the only thing he wants. And it doesn't appear until we get to the next chapter that David ever truly acknowledged his sin. I think it bothered him. I think he struggled with it. I think he understood I think eventually he understood the severity of it. But in the midst of it right here, he was just cruising along. And when you do something, like I said, you have to be careful because the devil will tell you that you're better off covering it up than confessing and forsaking it. He'll try to convince you that if you just cover it up, you'll be fine. As long as no one ever knows, then no one ever knows, and you'll be fine. But we understand that just because we think no one ever knows. God always knows. God always knows. That's why, I'm always intrigued by these people that think that they can do something to hide it from God. You're not hiding anything from God. As a matter of fact, God knew who you were before He ever saved you. God knew who you were before He ever saved you. God knew you were going to do it before it even was conceived in your brain to think about doing it. And so don't get into the mode of I can cover this up and everything will be fine. Understand that God knew who you were. And God knew that this was going to come in your life. And God knew whether you were going to pass or fail the test. And again, God wrote He had the men write the Bible, and He didn't just put people up on a pedestal and only show the good things they did. You start from Genesis 1 and you start reading and you name me someone, you're like, I wish I could be like so-and-so. I wish I could be like Abraham. Well, guess what? There's some things in Abraham's life that Abraham shouldn't have done. One of them is a child he ended up having that he shouldn't have had. And you just work your way down through the Bible, and very few people in the Bible will you read in the Bible where all you know is the good and there's nothing bad, you have nothing bad to say about them. God put that in there for us to understand that a just man falls 7 times, but he rises up again. But if you're going to rise up again, what do you have to do? You have to confess. You have to confess your sin. You have to acknowledge it. I acknowledge it and go on. You can't just try and keep covering it up. David was still in cover-up mode. And so he ate and drank before him, and he made him drunk. And at even he went out to lie on his bed with the servants of his Lord, but went not down to his house. And again, Brother Parks, it's progressing. So now David said, this is not going to work. And again, in my mind, I'm being like, all right, look, I got a new mission for you. I need some protection here in Jerusalem. And so now you're stationed in Jerusalem, and you're going to be here permanently, and I'm going to put some people under you, and I need you to protect the king's house and stuff while I'm here. And just gave him a mission where he's going to be in Jerusalem all the time and take away the excuse. That's me. But God didn't allow David to come up with that thought. And so he come up with this next thought, Brother Jay, and I think if you would have told David when Samuel was anointing him king, David, I want you to understand one day that you're going to be responsible for killing one of your best men. He'd have said, no way. One of the men that fought valiantly for you, one of the men that fought courageously for you, one of the men that would die for you, you are going to be responsible for killing that man. He would have said, you got the wrong David. You got the wrong guy. I love God. I love God so much I would never do that. And again, like I said, when you get into sin, it just keeps pulling you down and down and down and down. And again, he's in cover-up mode. And so he can't get help. He can't get help from God. He can't get help from the man of God. He can't get help from his trusted advisors. He can't get help from anybody. And so he ends up getting help from somebody, but it's not the kind of help he needed. He ends up getting help from Joab. And a lot of times you think about, and it's not chapter 12, but chapter 13, where the Bible says Amnon had a friend whose name was Jonadab, he was David's nephew, and it says Amnon had a friend. You need to watch. You need to watch who your friends are. When those friends are the ones that are helping you cover your sin, instead of helping you get that thing right. And again, I mean, I understand. I mean, when you're doing something wrong, I mean, we have reputations. For us as Christians, we have a testimony. We have a testimony and so we don't want ourselves to be put out there. And most of the time, you can just get right. You can just get right between you and God. But there are some times you just have to acknowledge that I need help. I need help. And so David got help, but he got help from someone, Joab, who as far as a military man, he was good at what he did. But he was a cold-blooded dude. He was cold-blooded. If you needed someone killed, Joab was your man. If you didn't need someone killed, but Joab felt like he needed to be killed, Joab was your man. And so, anyway, you understand that here it says in verse 14, it says, "It came to pass in the morning that David wrote a letter to Joab." Now, this is pretty bad. So he writes a letter, and we know what's going to be in the letter, but we're going to see what's in the letter. But to do what he does next, it says, "and sent it by the hand of Uriah." He said, this guy is such a good guy, and he's so faithful to the cause that I can write anything I want to in this letter and say, do not open this letter, just hand it to Joab, and know that Uriah was not going to open that letter. I mean, you think about it. Had Uriah just went out of Jerusalem, opened that letter, and said, hey, I want you to kill Uriah? But Uriah was not that guy. And David knew that Uriah was not that guy. And instead of saying, hey, I got one of these messengers, here's what I want you to do. I want you to take this letter to Joab, and then in a few days I'm going to send Uriah back to the battle. And Joab's already going to have the letter and know what it is. He sent it by the hand of Uriah. I mean, that is cold right there. I mean, that is stone cold right there. That you're like, hey, I'm going to send you. I'm going to let you carry your own death wish. I'm going to let you carry it with you and hand it to Joab. Stand before Joab, Uriah reporting for duty. Here's a letter from the king, King David. And then walk off, and Joab is going to read that letter, and it says, hey, I want you to kill Uriah. And that's pretty cold. That's pretty cold. But again, like I said, I mean, he's in cover up mode, and he just doesn't care. He just doesn't care. He doesn't care who it hurts. He's not thinking about Bathsheba right now. He's not thinking about Bathsheba. He's only thinking about David. That's all he's thinking about. And so we know that in verse 15 it says, and he wrote in the letter saying, set ye Uriah in the forefront of the hottest battle, and retire ye from him, that he may be smitten and die. And he knew, Brother Croft, he knew when he sent that to Joab, that Joab would do it. And again, eventually, even though David knew everything about Joab and how many times that Joab either had done or was going to break even David's heart for the people that Joab slew. I mean, eventually Joab is going to kill Absalom, even though David said don't kill him, he's going to kill Absalom. And eventually David's going to tell Solomon, hey, you need to take Joab out. You need to take Joab out. And so he sends that letter, he sends it to Joab, and he knew that if he sent it to Joab, that he would do it, and not only do it, but he would keep it on the hush-hush. Again, think about when Amnon had a friend whose name was Jonadab. Yeah, he had a real friend, and he come up with the scheme. He came up with the scheme so that Amnon could have Tamar. But guess what? When it was time for when Absalom was going to kill Amnon, guess who knew about it? Jonadab. Guess who was standing there beside the king whenever word comes back that all the king's sons were dead? And who was it that said, don't worry about that? Don't worry about that. It wasn't all your sons. It was just Amnon, because Absalom, from the time that he forced Tamar, was going to kill Amnon. I mean, that was some friend he had. That was a real friend that Amnon had. The fact that he's like, hey, he knew that Absalom was going to kill him. And oh, well, don't be upset about it, David. Don't be worried about it. Don't be too concerned. Because guess what? You know, it's just Amnon, the one that I'm supposed to be friends with, but, you know, I'm really not. And so here's David. And David has a friend like that in his life. His name is Joab. And so here's Joab, and instead of Joab said, and again, we know that Joab at times questioned David. At times questioned David and said, hey, I don't think we should do this. But here's a time where Joab doesn't question at all. He just says, all right. It says, verse 16, it says, and it came to pass when Joab observed the city that he assigned Uriah unto a place where he knew that valiant men were. So he looked around, and again, he'd been fighting this battle for a little while, Brother Croft. I say a little while. I mean, she knows she's pregnant, so it's been months. And so he's been fighting this battle for months, and now he knows where the valiant men are. He knows and recognizes those men. And he says, that's where I'm going to send Uriah. And so he sends Uriah in verse number 17. And the men of the city went out and fought with Joab. And there fell some of the people of the servants of David. And Uriah the Hittite died also. So he did exactly what he said. He said, I'm going to put him in the hottest spot of the battle. And I'm going to put him in a place where I know he's going to fail. Why? Because he knew their tactics. He knew that the men were going to come out. He knew that the men were going to come out, and the men were going to fight. And while the men were fighting, the archers were going to stand up on the wall, and they were going to shoot at the children of Israel fighting. And he said, "That's where I'm going to put Uriah." And so in verse number 13. It says, 18, then Joab sent and told David all the things concerning the war, and charged, and we're going to go through this pretty quick, and charged the messenger, saying, when thou hast made an end of telling the matter of the war unto the king, and if so be the king's wrath arise, and he say unto thee, wherefore approached ye so nigh unto the city? When ye did fight, knew ye not that they would shoot from the wall? Who smote Abimelech, the son of Jerubbaal? Did not a woman cast a millstone upon him from the wall, that he died in Thebez? Why went ye nigh unto the wall? Then say thou, thy servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also. So he said, look, I know David. I know him, and I know he's going to be upset. When he finds out a bunch of men have died, he's going to be upset. And so I need you, once you say it, I need you to cushion the blow a little bit. The messenger doesn't understand that it's cushioning the blow. It's not making it worse. It's cushioning it. And so in verse 22 says, so the messenger went and came and showed David all that Joab had sent for him. And the messenger said unto David, surely the men prevailed against us, and came out unto us into the field, and we were upon them even unto the entering of the gate. And the shooters shot from off the wall upon thy servants, and some of the king's servants be dead, and thy servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also. So he said, I'm just going to tell him the whole story, and I'm not even going to wait till he hollers at me. I'm just going to tell him, hey, Uriah is dead. Joab wanted me to tell him, so I'm just going to tell him right off, Uriah is dead also. And again, I understand that in war people die. You know, it just is. It is what it is. But here's a man that's coming and he's telling, and he's like, hey, more than just Uriah died here. It cost more than just Uriah his life. It cost multiple people their lives because David needed Uriah to die. It cost multiple people, multiple soldiers, multiple warriors, multiple people that fought for the cause, multiple people that were more dedicated to David and more dedicated to God than at this moment David was to God. And surely more dedicated than David was to them. So in verse number 25, again, like I said, I thought he was cold before whenever he sent the letter by Uriah, but look what happens here. Then David said unto the messenger, thus shalt thou say unto Joab, let not this thing displease thee, for the sword devoureth one as well as another. He said, don't let it bother you. Tell Joab it's no big deal. It's fine. It's just part of being in war. It's just part of being in war. It just, people die. People die in war. It's part of it. And couldn't have cared one iota that not only Uriah died, not only that Bathsheba lost her husband, not only that happened, but multiple other people lost their husband. Multiple other mothers lost their sons in this battle at this point, so that Uriah would die also. Again, it's not that they died because they were besieging Rabbah. It's not because they died. No, they died so that Uriah would die also. That's why they died. And he's like, it's no big deal. What are you worried about? Just tell Joab, don't let it bother you. The sword devours one as well as another. It's no big deal. Make the battle more strong against the city and overthrow it, and encourage thou him. I need you to go back, and I just need you to tell Joab, you're doing a great job. I'm really proud of you. As a matter of fact, I'm probably going to put another star on your shoulder when you get back, because you're a great general in my army. It's terrible. It's terrible. But again, David didn't care because he was in cover-up mode. He was in cover-up mode. And so then we get to verse number 26. It says, and when the wife of Uriah heard that Uriah, her husband, was dead, she mourned for her husband. Now, again, like I said, I haven't been focusing on Bathsheba yet, because I want to focus on her later. But, think about this, Brother Parks. Here's Bathsheba, and Brother Jay, I don't know that she knew what David's plan was. I don't think she knew what David's plan was. I don't know that she ever even knew that Uriah was back in Jerusalem. I don't know that she knew that. I think she's basically captive in her own house. She's captive in her own house, and she's there, and Uriah's in town, and she most likely doesn't know about it. And she surely doesn't know David's scheme that, hey, I'm going to put him in the forefront of the battle, and I'm going to have these people kill him. And so here she is, and so the first thing she hears about Uriah is someone came to her and said, hey, Uriah is dead. Uriah is dead. I don't think she felt relief, Miss Jimmy. I don't think she felt like, we're safe now. That's what David thought he was going to feel. That's what David thought he was going to feel, but that's not what she felt, because it said she mourned for her husband. That has in that mourning right there, that means she wailed. She wept and wailed for her husband. It was not just, my little fake tears, someone get me a Kleenex and let me wipe my fake tears away. That's not what that was right there. Here is Bathsheba, and she loved Uriah. And she loved Uriah so much that she did not want this to happen. She did not want that to happen. When she told David, hey, I'm with child, she did not expect David to say, well, that's fine, well, I'll take care of this. And if it doesn't get taken care of one way, I've got another way. I've got something in my back pocket right here that if all else fails, I can handle this situation. That wasn't what she was expecting to happen, Brother Jay. And so here she mourns for her husband. She was terribly distraught over the fact that Uriah was dead. And we're going to get into it when I get to focusing on Bathsheba. But she had to bear that on her conscience. Whatever part she had in the adultery. Now Uriah is dead, and she has to bear on her conscience that she had a part in him being dead. And at this point, all she knows is he was killed in battle. So at this point, all she is bearing on her conscience that she was not faithful to her husband, and now her husband's dead, and she has to bear that part on her conscience. At this point, that's all she knows. I don't think she knew that David did what he did. And so you get to verse number 27, it says, and when the morning was past, so, and again, like I said, I mean, David is still in just being a cold, just being cold. And you get cold on God, and you'll do things that if someone said, hey, you know you have this in you, and not me, it's not in there. Be like, no, it's in there. You don't understand it's in there, but it's in there. You get cold on God, and you will be shocked at the person you become. And so it says, when the morning was past, it looks to me, Gil, like what he did was he sent his messengers up there and say, is she still crying? Is she still crying? Can you hear her crying? Is she still weeping? Is she still all tore up? I mean, and let's be honest. I mean, most of us been in here, we don't know how to deal with our wives whenever they're in that emotional state. We don't know how to deal with them. You know, I mean, we don't know what to do. Should we hug them? Should we not hug them? Should we give them their space? If you give them their space, that's the time they want you to talk. If you talk to them, that's the time they need their space. Again, we're men. We don't understand what to do when our wives are tore up like that. But here, she's not his wife, and he's like, hey, just keep going down there, and then find out once she's kind of good, once she's kind of settled down. She can't weep forever. She can't cry forever. Eventually, she's got to get over it. And so he says, when the morning was past, David sent and fetched her. We looked at it earlier. Whenever it says in verse number 4, and David sent messengers and took her. And this one it says, he sent and fetched her. And so he went and said, all right, look, hey, your husband's dead. You're pregnant with my child. What else you going to do? You're not going to raise the child on your own. What you need to do is just come on down to the house. And guess what? If you say no, no's not an answer. No's not an option. We're going to take you. And it said they fetched her. And so they fetched her to his house, and she became his wife. She was kind of stuck. She became his wife and bare him a son. And the very last sentence here. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. All the covering up, Brother Croft, everything he done to cover this up, everything he done to hide this, guess what? He didn't hide a thing. Didn't hide a single thing. And everything you do, how hard you work, if you worked as hard getting right with God as you do at covering up your sin, you'd be a whole lot better off. If you worked as hard at just confessing and forsaking your sin than you do trying to cover and condone, you'd be so much better off. Because the whole time, everything David did right here, everything he did to hide this, the whole time God was sitting down saying, don't do it. Don't do it. Don't do it. And again, I don't understand. Sometimes I read my Bible and I'm like, God, why couldn't you have stopped this? Why could you not have stopped this? Why could you have not stopped Uriah? Why could you have not had Uriah read that letter? Why could you have not let Uriah survive that battle? Why could you have not? But he didn't. But what we do know is that he was watching. He was watching, and everything David thought he got away with, in the next chapter, we're going to find out he didn't get away with a single thing. Thank you.